Okay. Hello.
So start from the beginning.
This is the new beginning. Hello and welcome back, in many cases, to this week's episode of Conversations That Matter. Here, coming to you from a wisdom factory in Umbria, Italy.
With me, I'm Heidi Hörnlein, in the tech
Oh,
person
yes.
who has sweated a little bit to make it work.
Her fingers are tired.
Yeah.
But she can still speak. I am Mark Davenport. But we're going back to Heidi for some words about how to participate in this conversation.
Yeah, in case you are watching it now on YouTube, you can go to the Wisdom Factory /live streaming, and you will be directed to the personal website of our guest, Flemming Funch.
Yeah.
And there you can leave your comments, because we won't monitor the comments on YouTube. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe on Webinar Jam, as we are now using that platform, if I make it all together. Anyway, come on.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. And now we can actually go on to our business tonight of this very special and unique guest we have. Flemming Funch is here tonight. And his topic is new civilizations, conversational experiments, and collective intelligence, which is not the sort of title that you might expect from a modest and mild-mannered person, though he does wear outrageous T-shirts on occasion. But before we tell any more lies, just say hello, Flemming, and we'll start again here. All right.
Well, hello there. I think that was a perfectly good introduction. I actually feel more comfortable with like vast, complex, abstract topics like that. So that puts me right at ease, and it's a bit of a mystery what it will be about, but that's probably what we'll find out along the way. But thank you for the warm welcome.
Oh,
but I would like to know, I mean, I know you a little bit from the conversational experiments, but what made you enter into this sort of enterprise, let's say?
Well, some of it was sort of accidental. Like one thing I am known for in certain circles is the New Civilization Network, which is why it appears in the title. And that was an early social network, one would call it today, but that term didn't really exist back then. One had forums, and so some of it was invented at the time. So it was essentially getting a group of people together who were interested in changing the world in one fashion or another, and then trying to figure out how to do that. With some fundamental ideas intuited of that it maybe would be a self-organizing thing. It would be about smaller groups that would somehow work together on whatever inspired them, or individuals, and then connecting up small groups in a bigger network, and that essentially people would do whatever they would want to do to make the world a better place, or create a new civilization, we could say. And then the hope that somehow would be useful. And that turned out to be an interesting experiment, which both was successful and not successful. I don't know if I could say it changed the world very much. Well, a little bit, probably. But other things turned out to be more difficult than expected. And that leads to some of the other things. Like some of the things that are difficult is really, how do you get a group of people to work together in a constructive manner? I mean, there's an old-fashioned way, which is that somebody's the boss who maybe pays everybody else, or who uses some kind of force to make people do whatever they would want. Then, well, at least those things get done. It's much harder, it seems, to make people voluntarily do something constructive together. But so I've explored various experiments in trying to make that happen, which leads to some of the other parts of the topic, various experiments, collective intelligence, like how do groups of people become smarter together, smarter than people are individually? And that's a bit of a puzzle that's so far not completely solved.
Well, here's our chance. Three of us.
Well, so let's give it a chance. Well, I like topics that are not sort of set in advance. So I like sort of discovering it along the way, and that maybe through our conversation we become a little bit wiser by discovering some little corner of the problem that we understand better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I was a little bit distracted still by technical things, but what I was interested in, you talk about new civilizations.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean with that?
Well, it can bring up various kinds of ideas. It was at first meant as being a very ambitious term that felt attractive and new. It's something about the future, a different world.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow it seemed right at the time. I had heard it somewhere. A couple of people have mentioned it, and it's in that year when I started the New Civilization Network, which was in 1995. The idea suddenly showed up everywhere, or that term showed up everywhere. Suddenly, Gorbachev had written a book about a new civilization. Suddenly, Alvin Toffler wrote a book about the new civilization. And they meant sort of different things than I meant it, but still in the same direction, that let's create a different system somehow. So it was both very nice in that it's a vague term. It doesn't really say how or what it is. So it attracts a variety of people, which both is good and bad. It meant it was quite a good term to attract people who really wanted to do something positive for the future. The little negative in it is they might have made certain assumptions about what it is. So it brought together a very diverse group of people, and it sort of spread like wildfire rather quickly. I mean, I just sort of casually dropped the idea in a mailing list discussion group on whole systems that I was administering at the time. Like, here's an idea, maybe we make this kind of network. And I was thinking calling it something like the New Civilization Network. And like the same day, like 80, 100 people were like, well, we're joining, let's do it. And that quickly became thousands of people who sort of showed up to be part of this New Civilization Network. And there wasn't really anything there other than maybe some discussion groups, and it turned into something much bigger. So, and later on, I discovered some of the problems with that, and that people had different ideas about it. So, I mean, people would sort of have visions about what it was, and they would think that maybe the other people's vision of what a new civilization is would be the same, more or less, as theirs, which wasn't always the case.
Yeah.
And it's rather hard to make a group of visionaries work together. Harder than I thought. This, for some reason, mainly at first attracted rather high-level, important, well-known people who had visions about the future, but visionaries, not necessarily doers or builders or problem solvers or engineers, but like people who had visions.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered putting them together sometimes just became a big fight about whose vision was the best one. Not everybody who had a very nice, positive future vision could necessarily work together with other people who had other visions. Like, some people were good at it, no problem, but there were a few people who were problematic. So the result was in part that seeing the need for having better ways of working together. It is not enough to have a nice vision and to make a space for it. You also need to deal with, well, how do we respect each other? How do we navigate different opinions about things and still do something positive? And how can we get the right mix of people that actually could do something about it? My idea and network somehow attracted a certain subset of the population that were interesting, visionary people, but not necessarily the boots on the ground that would like do something very material about it. But it was still very interesting to explore and see the difficulties that came up and to overcome some of them.
Well, we're going back now over 20 years, and you mentioned Alvin Toffler and Mikhail Gorbachev, and I'm sure they had visions at the time. And I'm certainly the Gorbachevs didn't work out quite like he hoped it might. But I'm sure Alvin Toffler's also changed his views in 20 years or more. Or if not, that's a problem too.
And I would like to ask what your vision was and what is it now?
Well, my vision is not all that much different. I have a vision of a society that is sort of self-organizing. You could call that anarchy, or you could call that democracy, but it's like a bottom-up democracy thing where people have the freedom to more or less do what you feel needs to be done in your particular way. Like whatever we call our current societies, they tend to be sort of top-down in terms of how they're governed. I mean, there's lots of freedoms, lots of things you can do, but there's a government that makes a lot of rules about how things are done and what dimensions houses need to have and how you drive your car and many other things. And much of that is good, but the world is moving faster and faster and getting more chaotic or more complex. So it's getting harder and harder to control it from the top down that way. So my vision would be that we can find a way of more dealing with our local needs and problems and resources. The people who are closest to the problem or to the resource usually will be the best people at making decisions about it. So if we can make that work, that people actually do whatever is closest to them or whatever they're most passionate about, and we connect these things together in a way that can scale or that can actually work on a bigger size. That's the vision, and I have certain ideas of principles that are involved in that, which is a type of organized anarchy, essentially. Not anarchy in the sense that everybody against everybody else, but rather anarchy as a way of cooperating, meaning that you're free to individually do what you want to do, but you find others who maybe share similar goals, and you deal with difficulties along the way. Like, I believe very, very much in self-organization or in collective intelligence. And at the same time, I will happily admit that it's not something that's solved. There's no clear recipe for how do you make 1,000 people be smarter than one person or two people. It's not clear yet.
Can you see a direction in your many years now, over 2 decades, working at this, of a kind of evolution that is emerging toward your vision or a vision of how to work together? Certainly you've learned some things, but...
So I've learned a lot of things, which in part have changed my focus a bit to the smaller, like nowadays, like I'm facilitating the conversational experiments group, which is a way of solving the same thing, but in a much smaller way, meaning how does an actual group of a few people, 5 to 10 people at a time, how do they get along and do something generative and useful together, rather than how do we make a new civilization? So I realized that a lot of what's in the way is that people don't really know very well how to do that, how to have a constructive conversation. Well, we can have an interesting conversation, we can have a nice conversation like we do here, but if we actually need to do something together, if we maybe want to work on a common project or problem together, it's difficult to navigate. So I'm more interested in solving that problem now. At the same time, I should say I do see progress, even though the world in some ways is worse off for having more problems than it did back then. Other things have made progress. So I've noticed some maturity in how people work together. So that the types of people getting together. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. But the types of people that one would bring together at that point where it didn't totally work, it does. Hold on a second.
Yeah, that's the thing. You have to forget that We did that too often, no? At the beginning, switch off the phones. I have the phone here too. Fortunately, nobody calls us anymore, and so hope it won't ring.
My mobile. It was my fixed line, but that's true.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
Right.
Well,
what I did. We have. Go ahead.
What I did notice was more recently, where I see other groups of people coming together in a similar vein, people who want to make the world a better place. I do tend to see more maturity in that now than back then. So back 20 years ago, the people who had the willingness to do something big, but ran into sort of silly little problems of just getting along with other people or being open to different points of views. And that certainly exists today. There's a lot of polarization. But if we go for the people who somehow want to really do something about it, that have the vibe of wanting to work together in making the world a better place, they tend to somehow be more constructive or more mature about it, I seem to notice. It could just be that that's the type of people I run into. But I see similar attempts being more mature now. So I do sort of see an evolution towards being more accepting of diversity and different points of view. And that does make me feel hopeful about it. In another way, I mean, it is also getting worse in the sense of being more polarized, that people have a harder time, or it's totally black and white. But that at the same time makes the problem sort of more clear. In some ways, it's easier to solve a problem if it's presented in black and white, and you can really see it's a huge problem. Whereas back then, it seemed totally meaningful that putting 1,000 visionaries together should be a good thing. And of course, we would just sort of get to work and do it.
1,000 visionary cats. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can just like herd them together and they'll be
Nice.
Yes.
So also developing a certain humility about it, that it isn't that easy. I mean, you don't just invite those people together and then somehow things magically happen. I mean, many things happen magically, but it takes a little more work to really get somewhere.
That's the magic, that's important here, because I think that's what you try to cultivate with your weekly shows that Heidi usually participates in. It's you suggest a topic, something to consider for the hour, and then what's the technique? You do something that makes something new emerge that wasn't there at the beginning of the hour. Can you put that into words?
Well, for one thing, it certainly is what I'm trying to do. And it's in part by being open to that, being willing for something to emerge. And so a lot of things I do are about creating that kind of space where we together are creating something magic. So it's not particularly something I do, but I certainly make space for it, and I invite others to make space for it. So that's kind of like I said, that I'm more interested in conversations that are not that sort of evolve along the way, where it's not too fixed. And it takes a bit of persuasion to get other people to be in that kind of mindset, that actually you do expect something wonderful and new and interesting to show up. In my mind, it's quite natural. That's where most things come from. I mean, it's something you don't know in advance, so you make space for it and you look for it, or you feel for it, and it starts showing up. So it's just a holding space. I mean, I can't even explain it. There's no clear recipe for it, but it's something about holding space for it, and there needs to be something to trigger it. So in conversational experiments, we start with some kind of experiment or question or little game or something to do. But the interesting things happen more in the spaces in between, of what's a little unexpected and who shows up, and something somebody says suddenly becomes meaningful, or the silences. It's also being willing to be silent and not necessarily do anything. sometimes the most valuable moments are where the whole group just gets quiet and we just sort of sit there, and then, well, something happens. So, yeah. But I like that you called it magic, because that is sort of what it is for me. I mean, magic is not necessarily that something supernatural takes over. It's more like things happen in unexpected ways. You're willing to explore some pathways that are a little different, and you allow some space for that. You allow some space for the universe, or whatever we call it, to reorganize things and come through. So that takes stepping out of our heads a little bit and not be so sure about what it must be or how it must work. You need to allow some room for something to come through or to emerge or to show up.
Well, there's a kind of positive anxiety, in looking for something new, of being curious and trying to look. I want to say look into, but it's actually more of it's coming to the participants, I would say. But so
that might be a clue, because for me it has the opposite effect, that it makes me really calm and relaxed to look for something new. So it's more about getting things out of the way and not try so hard to make it anything in particular, and then it will tend to show up. It comes to you if you just can relax and be open to it. So that is some kind of clue to what I'm trying to do, that if we can just sort of get ourselves a bit out of the way and together allow something to show up. I mean, we have an idea of what kind of things we would like to show up, but we humans tend to be a little sort of arrogant about, even if we try not to, we think it has to be a certain type of thing, or we have certain assumptions, expectations. So a lot of the work would be to get that out of the way and allow it to come through, without having too many assumptions either about what is that. I mean, you can call that life, the universe, or collective intelligence is a good word for it. It doesn't necessarily come from any one person, but you put a group of people together, and under the right circumstances, something happens that's useful, that none of us really could predict. And it is kind of, it shows up, we discover it, and we don't know exactly how. So, but it's magic without having to make it supernatural. And without either getting lost in the explanations for what it must be. For me, it works to just be open to it. We need an ingredient of magic, and what form it manifests in, I don't really know.
It brings me back to a question it needs some people with a certain idea and a certain willingness to be in a certain way. So, and when you said you want to have from the bottom up, you call it democracy or something else, or anarchy, when we consider that people who have our mindset are relatively few, so it would be very easy that these attempts are overthrown. So I do agree, and I do think this is the future, to sense into the things and to let them come instead of doing. But when we are honest, I think 95% of the people are doers, at least, if not more. So how will we resolve that?
Well, I don't think it's a problem that they're doers necessarily. I mean, we're not necessarily talking about just sitting around waiting for something to appear. I mean, you can do it while doing things. So it's more about leaving space for something to emerge between people, to not try to control it in advance in your own interest, but allow space for things to happen between people.
Yeah, this is okay, and you are willing. But if you have one person in the group who is not willing to do that,
I don't want to do that. I'm scared of doing that.
It doesn't
I don't
work
want to
anymore.
go that far. No.
Well, we don't have hard. Yeah. So no, it's a very good point. So I have several answers to that. I mean, it's a general problem in society, or I think to solve that. Yeah, it would be nice if everybody would just sort of positive and constructive, but there's some people who aren't. There's some people who will just lie and steal and take advantage of everything. I think it's a relatively small percentage that are what we would call like sociopaths, where we're really, as a career, they're like that. They're evil or totally acting in their own interest, despite any input from others. So I think that's a rather small percentage, but it's unfortunately that kind of people who, to a large degree, have the upper hand and who would tend to end up in government or on the top of companies or owning everything. That's a problem. So it would be a very important problem to solve, of how to deal with sociopaths in society. And I think part of that answer is that the majority of people, if they had the chance, they would want to do more or less the good thing. They might have very different ideas about what it is, but most people would like to that the environment is not polluted, and would like that people aren't hungry, and they would like a lot of things that are good. I mean, most people don't want war and hunger and lots of bad things, but they somehow get it anyway. And whereas there's a small percentage of people who actively are creating those things, and there's a much larger percentage of people who somehow, by their unconsciousness, are going along with it, but it's not really what they would want if they had a chance. So there's how do we structure a society so that it's bulletproof in regards to sociopaths? There's that. And part of my answer would be something along the lines of small groups where people trust each other. Like it's not that we should go back to a village model, but there is something to say for a village where everybody knows each other. And if there's a threat that shows up in the village, people would tend to band together and deal with it. So if somebody's too much of a jerk, then somebody will probably put them in their place. And you cannot just sort of come in and run everything. If it's a village, there's lots of bad things in the past too. Well, somebody could be the evil lord that makes everybody work for him. It's entirely possible too. So it's not like the path was all glorious, but there's something in the model of a village where everybody knows each other, everybody's watching out for each other. And if somebody's not pulling their weight in some way, then somebody will probably deal with it. And in some fashion, there's a built-in sort of self-regulation. So there's the small groups know each other and they can look out for each other. That's one possible answer.
But wait, this control in a village is also in the opposite. If somebody wants to be introduce something new, then they are dimmed down too.
That's not how we do things here. So there are various problems in that. But if we can capture some of what works positively in a village, that people are watching out for each other, there will be a self-adjusting thing. If somebody is not able to work, then their neighbors will probably give them something to eat and so forth, because you know each other and you know the whole thing sort of needs to work. So and yes, it's a little resistant to maybe new ideas, but it's also resistant to sociopaths to a large degree. Like if somebody's too much of an asshole and you're just living in your own distant little village, well, that guy might end up being hung in a tree or something. And I'm not saying we should return to that, but there's some intelligence in a small group sort of dealing with things in their own way, which we are missing in our modern Western society, where people are very anonymously dealing with each other. It's much more possible to be a sociopath and gain a lot of power because you don't have a group of people around that are protecting each other or watching what people do. It's a little hard to keep track of everybody else. So I can imagine a possible way of organizing things by having stronger, smaller groups that don't let anybody in who would be a sociopath. And there's also, in a different vein, like just to be able to create that kind of vibe or environment where something might emerge. There, I can also see that a few people, or even one individual, can potentially create the right vibe for a small group around them. Like if we have 10 people together, and if just one of them can sort of plug into that kind of space of, well, how can we just be quiet and see what and see what wants to emerge here amongst us. One person who really sort of gets that can potentially create that space for others. So it's not necessarily that everybody needs to get it, but like one person can facilitate that 50 people get it potentially. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine that more people are able to sort of bring about or invite or create space for a certain vibe that's a little more cooperative, a little more ready to explore, a little more open to diversity. And that's not that easy to do, but it could in part be by recognizing it and being able to defend it against potential attacks. It's not just all nice and fuzzy. I mean, a random group of people that you put together, there will be some people who will be difficult to deal with, or who don't just want to be quiet and all have things emerge amongst us. That's bullshit. There will be people who will be like of a different mindset. So like, how do you manage that? And I don't think the answer is just to sort of sit and all be really like pleasant and loving. I mean, it's in part being ready to defend what you're doing. And what we're talking about here is a rather vulnerable kind of thing, that people are willing to be authentic and open and to share what's going on for them, potentially publicly, like the conversational experiments. It's shared on YouTube. Anybody can go and look at it. That's a bit can feel a bit dangerous. So it's totally possible that one might need to take steps to protect vulnerable generative spaces like that, but that's part of it. So I think it could become something that is not seen just as weak and vulnerable, but potentially as a strength, that one can accomplish more in some fashion by creating spaces like that. We're not quite there yet, so right now it's still sort of vulnerable and a little unclear what it is, but I think we could get to a point where to accomplish great things, you need to get people together who are real and authentic and willing to tell the truth and willing to act on it and willing to protect that kind of space.
So what I hear you saying is fighting for it or defending it. I was more thinking in terms of creating or becoming leaders who are good in inspiring people to follow them. I sort of talk about a positive manipulation here, to be able to have a charisma and to bring your ideas over to people who are not by themselves in the way to have these ideas. And I see this as a big challenge for people like us who want to do things like that, because it needs so much different communication skills, which you a little bit are practicing, no, in the groups. Mm-hmm. But more for many more people, we need to learn these things, which we don't learn at school, we don't learn in family, we don't learn in political discussions or wherever, you know. So I would like to point on the capacity of people to grow, and on the other hand, on the need of good leaders to grow themselves first and then help other people to grow.
Grow themselves first?
Yeah.
Oh.
Or why don't like everybody else do? So, I mean, yeah, I totally agree. Like a few people who are willing to stand up and inspire others and share their experiences and speak well for it can make a huge difference. And the more people like that there are, the more sort of safe that can be, where you're not the only crazy person standing up. But if there are others, if you have friends who are maybe doing something similar, and I would still bring in the sort of need for defense to some degree. Although, I mean, it's not a war, but it's not enough to stand up and be inspiring and present more soft and cooperative ideas. You need to be ready to sort of deal with possible counterpoints or attacks to that, in a sense that you shouldn't like fall apart the moment somebody has something negative to say about that. So you need to be able to stand up for it and keep standing up even if other people don't totally agree. And that makes it harder, but it's more realistic.
Emotional intelligence, which is really difficult to learn. And when you look around, I know it by myself, it's very difficult for women especially. And when you look how all the arguments, like now today, the Me Too again, how they are addressed emotionally and not by facts or evidence, just you know. That is not a way where we can create understanding.
No, but so you need to be able to navigate that in some fashion and be willing to have and express emotions without it falling apart. So and sort of to have some kind of alignment between your own different parts, that you can both logically and intelligently express what you have to say and at the same time deal with your own emotions about it. Emotions about other people who maybe have negative emotions about what you say. So yeah, that asks for quite a lot of maturity on various levels, which is hard to develop. But I like how you put it. I mean, there's a big role for people who are in some fashion lighthouses or who are willing to stand up for something and speak for it. And there's a lot to say for good communication and being able to communicate it clearly. Like individuals can reach hundreds or thousands of other people who maybe get changed or activated or inspired a little bit. And that's a huge role. So like if people don't feel sort of ready to sort of step up and find their own role in it or their own thing, it helps to see somebody else do it well and speak for it and even defend it if necessary.
It's a little bit what we are doing, what you are doing, what we are doing, to hope that somebody who is listening will be inspired in some way to stand up themselves.
Yeah, here among the three of us, we're all agreeing on everything. There's no conflict. No big egos shining forth that we know of yet, anyway. And and so this is easy. We just smile and we have a pleasant conversation when we agree on everything, and then we go our own way, you know. And there's another show next week, or whatever.
Yeah. So that's kind of all. I mean, we can do that. I mean, it's just a little thing, or we might perceive it as, well, we're just doing our little thing and there are a few people watching it, but that often has a bigger effect than we think. Like more people are inspired by it and they see it's possible, or they might launch their little thing and then they overlap a little bit, like we visit each other's little activities, and then more of a network is forming like that. So we shouldn't underestimate the effect of what we're doing just by standing up and doing our thing.
We normally don't get the feedback, but in one case I know it because my sister, I invited her 3-4 years ago in the show, and she had never done these things, and she is now great in podcasting and on iTunes and whatever. She has really taken it off now. And the other people we have introduced, like Jeff Sorsman, his first video appearance was with us, and now he is doing an Integral Live every week, 3 times on video, you know. So that is sort of a satisfaction that a little bit people got inspired by our poking them, you know.
Yeah. Now, if we just had affiliate relationships.
I should mention, like, I've talked about the New Civilization Network, which in some ways sort of ended up a little bit of a failed experiment where we sort of, people moved on kind of thing. But in other ways, I keep meeting people who were very inspired or changed their lives back then, or it has made a huge difference in their lives and what they do now. Just the little things that happened back then. And one example, since there were relatively few means for it, you couldn't do live video kind of stuff like now. So one thing I did every month was I would send out an email with collected visions from members of the New Civilization Network. So people would just send in, what's my vision of the future, or something that they wanted to work on. And another newsletter was, well, what are people doing? People would send in their little accounts of some project they're doing and their progress or their difficulties, but mostly, hey, this is what we're working on, we're a group of people, or hey, we're looking for some people to do this. And just all I did was being the editor of collecting a little group of visions and a little group of, hey, these are success stories or news of what people are doing. And just those were tremendously powerful for people. There was nothing much to it. It was just some nice words or some updates of what people were doing. And just that made lots and lots of people inspired and feeling like there really is a network of people working on making a new civilization, or whatever we call it. So just getting news from it. So in some ways, that's a little harder to do now because it's sort of more noisy. We have a Facebook feed and there's so much stuff going on. It's a little hard, it's a little unclear. Whereas back then, one email per month of positive visions that made a huge impact. I don't know how to do something similar. Or, well, maybe that's what we're doing here. We're doing videos and putting them on YouTube. And so it can do the same thing. So just putting it out and just happily noticing maybe much later how inspired people were. We don't know it at the time. Like, I didn't know at the time many of the things people come thanking me for 20 years later. I had no idea. It right to me. I didn't realize that changed your life. I was just doing my little job, which was quite simple and straightforward at the time. So well, we can just keep doing it and connect with others doing the same. And yeah.
That's interesting because we do keep doing it, you know?
And I always say, I don't know why I do that. All the work with the websites and all the technical stuff. I have learned for 5 or 6 years, all the technical. I was an anti-tech person, really, completely. And I sort of have this feeling that I do it, and I don't know why, but I do it, and I continue to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I ask myself sometimes, why are you doing that, all that stuff? You know, it takes a lot of time. I could sit there in the sun and instead, I don't, but I do these things.
What sun?
Yeah. Sometimes I ask myself, is it the collective, let's say, intelligence, the collective push or impulse for us to really do something, even if it's not as grandiose as if we wanted to, but it's little, but we do without expecting to be, you know.
Oh, it's a pull. It's a pull. Like for me, having some kind of adventure you're on, or some kind of journey, or something you're trying to do, even if you don't know quite why, but it attracts you. It keeps moving you because there's something more. There are good things that come out of it. And that kind of persistence in keeping that journey, there's tremendous power in that. A lot of people don't continue their journeys. They start, but then it's too much trouble and they don't do it. And even if the journey sometimes is like tiring, or like, well, why do I keep doing that? Or I'm not sure. Still putting one foot in front of the other, it gets you somewhere. And one might not realize before 20 years later how many people were impacted by what you did, by just seemingly continuing doing what you're doing. But I mean, that leaves a mark, and it leaves room for it going somewhere. I mean, you don't have to know in advance where that is, but just it's actually better if you don't. You just somehow feel like doing it and letting it evolve in its own way.
It makes me think of the fields. No, I don't know if you know Rupert Sheldrake, who is talking about the morphogenetic fields and these things, as if we are together in a field which is doing this, and that we are part of a network, you can say. But field is more, let's say, more general.
It's more instantaneous give and take. It's actually a living substance that doesn't stay the same from one second to the next.
Yeah, so that's also a way of sort of relaxing more about it. That it's not just about you and your plan or whether you're in control of it. I mean, you're to some degree serving the field that you're in, or you're seeing where it goes. The field has a life of its own. And it doesn't make sense to just cut it off. I mean, if it's really there and if it's going somewhere, well, let's go with it. So I think like having more awareness of that. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do with conversational experiments too, an awareness of, well, what do we have here? What kind of field is there? What wants to happen right here? And without having to have clever answers to it, but more being in service to it and allowing it to move through you or between us or whatever it is. That still sounds like a little mumbo jumbo or vulnerable, but I think we more and more will be operating that way, and that it's going to end up being more clear that it's a useful way of doing it.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about things growing and changing, evolving here, and I'm just wondering if you can look back over your 20-some years of pushing in the same general direction. Are there things that 20 years ago you could not have conceived of happening because you weren't there yet, just in your own personal development? Is that's a hard question, perhaps?
That's a hard question, but certainly I've evolved in that time, and my orientation has changed. Like, for example, now I would probably look more towards myself, whereas back then I would more look at, hey, what does the world need? What needs to happen in the world? Which is a good thing, but it's sort of a little fake that I think I can do something to save the world, where maybe I should more focus on, well, what am I passionate about doing? And there may be more authentic answer is what drives me, be more present with my own path. I would tend to do that more now, whereas back then I was more trying to be in service to the world, something like that. And I think paradoxically, we're likely to be more in service to the world by being present with our own journey, whatever it is, even if it's not clear right now how that really might be useful to the universe that we do what we do. But I think it inherently has. I mean, if we're driven by something that really feels right, that feels like our thing, that feels like it moves us forward, that we're driven by some kind of mystery or discovery or a satisfaction along the way of what we're doing, that will in principle end up being useful not just to ourselves but to people around us and to the world. And so I would tend to prefer that kind of focus rather than, well, how do we fix the world kind of thing. Not that we should ignore the problems in the world, but we're probably more likely to get somewhere by including very much our own situation and position. So that's different from how I would look at it back then, and that would maybe solve some of the difficulties I was having with some things of trying to make a bunch of people do something together, where they really should be doing their own work in more intensively, and then we can see how that leads to something bigger.
Yeah. That's my conviction, that we have to work on ourselves first. And even if it's not perfect, go out anyway. And I got a nice comment here from Gina. She said, I am grateful that you are doing. I have learned a lot and feel very inspired to share some of those learnings. Thank you very much, Gina.
Thank you,
That's
Gina.
good.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
So it's great to get feedback like that. One doesn't have to need it, but it's really nice to see that.
Yeah, that is, we need it sometimes, you know.
We both do it, but I spend more time on it than she does. A page on Facebook, a group on Facebook called Masterminding Integral Aging. And it started out raging against ageism was the main theme, you know, and it just grew. And then we realized that much of the ageism was internal, that we aging people were guilty of the same things, you know, and we were actually, everyone was going to be against themselves sooner or later if we pursued that. But anyway, it just spread into all kinds of domains affecting what happens as we grow older. And I got these wonderful compliments from people in recent months, some people I admire deeply, saying that this group is one of the best on Facebook ever, you know.
For that topic, probably.
for the topic, you know. And they had obviously incorporated much of the information we've been posting. And this is so wonderful, you know. You don't make any money with this group, but oh, wow, you know, it just feels like, oh, I'm doing something.
It's different. That's because he has the group. I allow him to be so much on Facebook whole day.
That's why. It's good.
That's why.
And besides, I have a pension, so there.
Yeah, no, but it talks about doing something for the satisfaction of doing it. I mean, it's not for the payoff in a few years. I mean, if you put your heart into it and you're happy with what you're doing right now, and it's nice that other people notice it too, but it shouldn't be the reason for doing it. It should be doing it for what you feel while you're doing it. This feels good. So,
yeah. I'm thinking about when I was a singer and we did a concert and there were only 3 people in the audience. That's a little bit disappointing. So, you know, there is both. You do it for yourself, but you also want to give it out and to have somebody to receive it. And I'm glad that we have some people who receive it. And I'm glad that your group is growing or changing every time. You know what I find so interesting? The conversations, how they come, how deep they go, depends on who is there, who is contributing. There are sometimes some people arrive and then bong, all at once the conversation goes to a different level. Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't. So
yeah, so I think it's interesting also to try to find some of the keys to that. Like if somebody shows up and suddenly it goes deeper, well, what did that person do? I mean, magic, but it would be nice to understand a little better, like to maybe be able to do that too. And part of my dream of it is that people who get really very good at it, you would be that kind of person who walks into the room and suddenly everything goes much deeper. Why not?
That's nice.
My idea is that people begin to share from their heart from themselves without talking theory too much. Sometimes a little theory is good, but really, you know, not just throwing out words.
And that's easy to say, but it's hard to really pin down when are we doing it. So it's also our own discovery process of noticing, am I just talking words now, or am I really am I connected with something in myself? And I catch myself in one direction or another. Sometimes I'm just saying words, but sometimes I got something. So I think we can develop that sense in ourselves. And the better we're at it, the more likely it is that we can invite others to sort of reach another level, or that we can share a vibe or create a space around that.
So we can sort of conclude, because we are about an hour now on, that 2 things need to happen. First of all, we need to become ourselves.
Who else?
and grow ourselves, and then
The closest.
become more open to let's say to the world, to more receptive, no? But let things arise. That's more or less what I understood what you were saying.
Yeah, and the value of that, and how that indirectly or rather directly can be an excellent example for others who then can find within themselves the freedom or the power to become more themselves and do their thing, which we probably need. So in our society, we spend so much of the time trying to emulate others or doing what we're supposed to do, or complaining about what others are doing, or complaining that we can't do what we would like to do, instead of just sort of getting down to it and connecting with, well, what is it really we feel we should be doing? So if we can get better at that, or more of us can act as examples or invite others to show up and be themselves, it doesn't have to come from us, but maybe just giving the space for it, which is what we do with, like, you interview people here, having conversations in the conversational experiments. We're giving space for it, and we don't know from who it will come. Like, somebody will walk in and somehow, bing, we get something, and it moves us forward a little bit.
Yeah, we should tell people that these conversational experiments, this is a group in Facebook.
Where do we find that anyway?
Yeah. I think typing
the link is there somewhere, but otherwise search for Conversational Experiments on Facebook, and most likely you'll find that somebody you know is either a member or something. It will probably bring it up for you. And
and Flemming is really great every single week. He is there and is doing it. We at least do Christmas holidays or summer holidays, and not broadcasting. You are there all the time. That is a commitment which is really great. Thank you.
Well, the persistence pays off even if you don't always see it at the time.
Okay. We hope you see it.
So for conclusion, a little bit takeaway.
I actually, I want to bring up something I didn't bring up. Not that we'll resolve it or anything, but just, there's been some resistance to me jumping into the your group.
From who?
Well,
no, I think you're very welcome.
Yeah. Well,
you're very welcome. I like how you do it. You just suddenly pop into the window and you listen to the background.
No, I'm not. I don't see resistance from the group. The resistance is in me. Am I going to get into something that's going to embarrass me, or it's going to expose the fraud that I am? And it's. Yeah.
And the other thing which is difficult, there are many little windows, and we have to squeeze even nearer together to get into the video.
Yeah, that's too bad.
That's why I normally don't use this service, because I have to really see where I can get my arm to to be into the video window.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I don't know if you should join, Mark. It might be dangerous. You might reveal too much of yourself.
Just a damn minute here. I'll join if I want to.
Right. So we have some fun. Yeah, I really enjoyed that you came with us here to this show.
Too. I'm glad it worked out technically in the different locations.
Yeah.
The first year I was always in panic when things like that happen. Now I think, okay, slowly, one step after the other. Now I know what to do. So
I panic a little bit too if I make a meeting and then I can't connect, or my connection is bad or something. But I've learned to get better at it. Something useful happens anyway.
Yeah, and we made it, and we will see in your conversational experiment next week.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
All right.
Somewhere else.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.